Dear listeners, in order for the channel to continue to exist and improve the quality of its content, please subscribe. 97% of our viewers watch without a subscription. Enjoy watching. The beginning of my life can safely be called unfortunate. My parents married early. My mother was 18 and my father was 21. They loved each other passionately, and 9.5 months after the wedding, I was born. After another year and a half of struggling with the child, my mother suddenly realized that her marriage to my father was a fatal mistake and got herself a lover. The lover lived next door while the husband went to work to earn money for his wife and little son, and the wife went to her lover. The child went to daycare while she spent her evenings with her lover. The husband would come home to a faithful and loving wife, but this went on for almost 2.5 years until someone told my father about his wife's infidelity. Of course, my father was furious. He rushed home in the afternoon to the neighbor's house, knocking and scolding. The neighbor opened the door and let him in. My father went into the bedroom and found his young wife naked. She yelled at him, calling him impotent, not a man, a wimp who had ruined her youth. My father couldn't take it anymore and slapped her in the face. The neighbor stood up for his mistress and hit my father on the head with a stool. My father fell down and didn't move. The ambulance and police were called, and my father was taken to the hospital, while the lover was taken to the police. My father lay there for a couple of days and died without regaining consciousness. The neighbor was facing a real-life sentence, but my mother sold the apartment and bought out the lover. My mother and I moved in with her new husband. I was 4 years old, and I understood something was wrong. My mother took me to an orphanage and wrote a paper saying that she was giving up her child. Without looking at me, she left. I broke free from the nurse's hands and followed her, crying and begging her not to leave me. She smacked my hands and yelled at me, and I was torn away from my mother. I stayed at the orphanage, an orphan with a living mother. That would have been all right, but I stopped talking. They tormented me and transferred me to a boarding school for children with mental and physical disabilities. I lived there until I came of age. My speech came back when I was about 14. I studied well, and after the 8th grade, I was transferred to a regular boarding school. However, I had a girlfriend who stayed at the old boarding school. We became very good friends, even though she stuttered a lot. Especially when she got nervous. I was going to my bedroom one evening and I heard someone squeaking. I looked up, and the older boys had the little girl pinned down and were under her dress. She was crying silently and couldn't say anything but squeak. The boys were laughing. They were having fun picking on the little girl. I stood up for her, and she hasn't left my side since. I didn't chase her away. At least she was a close friend. She cried a lot when I left, and I didn't feel well. I was afraid that they would hurt her, so I warned someone that if anything happened, there would be no mercy. I graduated from high school with a gold medal and applied for the military academy. I got into the military intelligence department and moved from one barracks to another. I was used to it. I studied for 5 years and graduated with the rank of lieutenant. I didn't forget about my girlfriend. I went to her graduation as a cadet in uniform. Of course, all the female students at the boarding school couldn't take their eyes off me. My girlfriend stood aside and was afraid to approach. She couldn't say a word out of excitement. She just cried. When I looked at her, my heart sank. I went up to her and hugged her. We danced together the whole evening and then silently walked until dawn. The warm June evening swirled our heads and everything happened. I then saw her off to the boarding school, kissed her goodbye, and she clung to me and couldn't let go. The next day I left for my duty station. I didn't take the leave I was supposed to after graduating from the academy because I had nowhere to go. So I immediately plunged into the Army's everyday life. However, my service didn't last long. Our battalion was transferred to another hotspot, and in the first fight I was wounded by shrapnel. I was hospitalized for 6 months and received an order before being discharged for health reasons. I was lucky to receive a pension and a room in my hometown. That's how I found myself as a civilian. I didn't have many options with just a pension. One day I was in a beer hall and ran into an old friend from boarding school. We got to talking, and he suggested that I join him in the bank security department as they had a vacancy. Putting aside my unfinished mug, my friend told me, "Let's go right now." In general, they talked to me, got a certificate from the military enlistment office, and I was hired. I worked there for almost half a year. By that time, I was 24 years old. I must say I was a handsome guy both in body and face. Some female customers craned their necks as they passed me. I had no idea that beauty is a terrible force. One day, the head of security summoned me and ordered me to escort the bank manager home. Her security guard was sick, and she asked me to send someone to replace him. I got into her car next to the chauffeur. She sat in the back, and I felt like she couldn't take her eyes off me. We arrived at the country house. Larissa, that was the name of the manager, let the driver go and asked me to take the packages to the house. I brought them in, put them in the kitchen, and was ready to leave. But the hostess offered to have tea. What to do? I had to agree. She suggested having a glass of cognac to our acquaintance. And then we slowly moved to the couch and made love. I must assume that I turned out to be a pretty good lover. I already had some experience and practice, and she was above all praise despite her age. In general, she liked me, and she kept me with her as a guard. And so I lived in the mansion for almost 3 years. I guarded day and night without a break from work. And then Larissa got married, but I was offered to stay with her in my former capacity. That is, to continue to be a security guard, only now mostly at night. Frankly, I was already tired of being a sex toy for an aging lady, and I very politely declined. In general, we parted as friends. At parting, she put a tidy sum into my account, and I saved some money for 3 years. I thought about it and decided to start my own business. When I was still a student at the academy, I made friends with technology. And by profession, I am a civil engineer and mechanical engineer. I bought 3 heavy truck tractors, hired a couple of smart guys, and started trucking. It worked. After 2 years, I moved from the cab of the truck into an office with a soft chair. I went to Larissa for old time's sake, and she, remembering those wonderful moments, gave me a loan for business development. Anyway, in another year, I opened several branches in the Arblast and the region, built a car service, and bought several gas stations. I went from being just a good-looking guy to a rich, handsome guy. And the hunt for me began. There was no shortage of brides. Everywhere I went, there was a swarm of butterflies, women. Frankly, it was beginning to bore me. And I realized it was time to settle down. Just at this time, an acquaintance called and asked to hire a friend's daughter. Vacancies in the head office I had, and I agreed. The next day, a pretty blonde in her 20s named Ina burst into my office. I assigned her to the logistics department, and when my secretary went on maternity leave, I transferred Ina to her place. The new secretary had a rare ability to be in the right place at the right time, and after a while, I could not make a move without her help. I couldn't function without her. Gradually, our business relationship turned into a personal one, and after 6 months of dating, I proposed to Ina. I was completely in love with her. Growing up without a family or a mother's love, I was drawn to her with all my heart. The thought of having a family made my heart ache with sweetness. Ina quit her job and took charge of our lives. I happily fulfilled her every desire. I spared no expense for the woman I loved. Ina transformed our home, hiring a cook, a maid, and a chauffeur. She indulged in massages, spa treatments, and shopping. She was exhausted during the day and had no energy left to do household chores in the evening. We never discussed having children. I once brought it up, but she harshly told me that she wasn't ready yet. She said we would talk about it when we were more financially stable. I couldn't help but wonder, what were we waiting for? A year went by and Ina blossomed even more. She had many girlfriends and spent less and less time at home. She no longer had time for me. She spent most of her days socializing with her friends and sometimes didn't even come home at night. I checked on her a few times, but she really was staying over at her friends' houses. I tried to brush it off and focused on my work. My business was thriving, and I often had to go on long business trips. I trusted my wife and didn't worry about her lifestyle. One day in late October, I was leaving for a business trip. A lucrative contract for large volume shipments had come up, and I needed to discuss the terms with the client. When we said goodbye, Ina even cried. I promised to call and not stay away for too long, then headed to the airport. After checking in and calling my beloved wife, I was about to board the plane when my partner called and apologetically postponed our meeting for a week. Something had come up. I tried to call Ina and make her happy, but her phone was off. I took a cab and bought flowers, cognac, and chocolates on the way home. The door opened silently, and I was met with complete silence. I turned on the lights and realized that no one was on the first floor. Where was Ina? I put the bag of food on the phone table and went upstairs to the far bedroom, feeling a sense of unease. The bedroom light was on, but not as bright as the first floor. I saw two naked bodies embracing on our bed. Ina's head was thrown back, her hands clenched into fists as she listened to the waves of passion. Time. Her head jerked in time with the thrusts of the hairy and muscular male body, her legs wrapped around the thighs of the young man, who rose above her on his elbows, growling triumphantly, looking into her face with a crooked grin. It seemed to me that her legs were also embedded in the floor, because she wasn't screaming, wasn't lashing out. My gaze fixed on the neatly folded dress on the chair, and I heard the painfully familiar gasp of passion in my wife's voice. Deeper, deeper. Oh God, it feels so good. As if waking up, I growled something unintelligible, and the two on the bed finally saw me. The hairy lover, as if thrown up by an invisible spring, jumped to the opposite corner of the bed. His manhood quickly shrank back. Trying to cover himself with one hand, he put his other arm out as if trying to shield himself from my gaze. Don't. Please, please, I said, my voice filled with anger and hurt. I wouldn't have hesitated to hit him if he had his clothes on. But I couldn't bring myself to touch him when he was completely naked. Ina stood up quietly, with a wandering smile on her face, picked up the dress on the chair, and headed out of the room, throwing me a calm look as she passed by. Leave him alone. He has nothing to do with this, she said, her voice pleading. I heard the door of the adjoining room slam shut. I stood there, seething with anger. The lover timidly took a step toward his clothes, seeing that I wasn't going to harm him. He quickly grabbed his pants and began to dress frantically. After a while, Ina entered the room again, smelling of soap and perfume. She lifted the hem of her dress, adjusted her stockings, and sat down on the couch. I continued to stand with my head down, trying not to look at her. She finally broke through and came right up to me, proudly raising her head, grinning and looking me in the face. You can hit me if you want, she said, her voice trembling. I was silent. My feelings were gone, replaced by an unbearable pain burning in my chest. I clenched my fists, trying to control my emotions. How was it? I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she seemed to break in an instant. She stepped back, fell onto the couch, and sobbed uncontrollably. The lover, who had already dressed, tried to sneak out of the room. I'm sorry, she's the one, he whimpered pathetically as he rushed out the door. Ina, I said with disgust, using her once beloved name. I'm gonna leave now, but I'll be back in the morning. Make sure you're not here when I come back. She started to say something through her tears, but I didn't listen. I left the bedroom and stepped out into the dark, rainy night. I pulled up my collar and walked along the wet streets, feeling completely alone. I have no luck with women, I thought bitterly. First my mother betrayed me, and now my wife. Gradually, the pain began to subside. Maybe it's my fate to be alone, I thought as I walked on. But one question still haunts me. The question kept haunting me. What was I doing wrong? Suddenly I heard a squeak and flinched. It had happened before. The image of the crying girl and the laughing bastards came back to my mind. I stopped, looked around, and saw a small, dirty puppy huddled against the concrete curb, shivering in the cold. I leaned over and picked it up. The puppy was so skinny that I could feel the brittle bones protruding through its skin and the quick beats of its little heart. What, little brother, are you alone too? The puppy wiggled in my arms and snuggled up to me. You two were abandoned? I thought to myself, well, nothing, now there are two of us. We will get through. I raised my hand and stopped a passing cab. When I came home the next day, Ina was still there. She was trying to explain something to me and asking for forgiveness. She sang an old women's song about the lack of attention, claiming that I had stopped seeing her as a woman. She even went so far as to say that she had cheated on me out of great love. According to her, the more a woman loves a man, the more likely she is to cheat. I listened silently to this nonsense and wanted only one thing, for her to quickly disappear from my life. And so I threw myself into work and spent my evenings in the company of my hairy friend. But more and more often, I found myself thinking about my girlfriend from boarding school. Where was she? What had happened to her? Was she already married? One day, I couldn't take it anymore and stopped by my old boarding school. As I walked through the humming corridors with yellow walls, a familiar stuttering female voice caught my attention, and I flinched. I exclaimed as I saw my childhood friend standing in front of me. She hadn't changed at all. "Do you work here?" Natasha was silent, her face suddenly turning white and her eyes filling with tears. Damn, I completely forgot, I thought to myself. She stutters and can't speak when she's worried. I took a step towards her and hugged her. "I'm so sorry," I said, looking at her tear-stained face. "Forgive me if you can." I kissed her wet cheeks. Natasha pressed herself against me and stroked my shoulder. We stood there with our arms around each other. "Mom," a child's voice called out behind me. I turned around to see a little boy, about 7 years old, snuggled up to Natasha. Strangely, I had never seen him before, but he seemed familiar. And then it dawned on me. I looked at Natasha and she just nodded silently. 9 months later, there was one more child in our family. Natasha and I had a daughter,